In the autumn of 1943, on a hot airfield in Rabaul, an intelligence report went around. It reached Japan's best naval pilots. The report described a new American fighter. It was a strong, heavy aircraft. Americans called it the Hellcat. One man who read this was Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai. He was one of Japan's greatest living aces. A year before, over Guadalcanal, enemy fire ripped through his cockpit. He was severely wounded. A bullet grazed his skull. Shattered glass destroyed his right eye. What followed was seen as a miracle of flying. He flew his damaged Zero fighter for almost 5 hours. He traveled over 560 nautical miles. He was blind in one eye. Still, he brought it home. Now serving as a trainer, his one good eye scanned the new American machine's details. He laughed. He was not alone. The proud pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy were masters of the sky. The report seemed like a mistake to them. They saw the Hellcat. It weighed almost twice as much as their beloved Zero. They called it a clumsy machine. They saw it as more flawed American thinking. They thought America tried to replace pilot skill with heavy planes. Through the tent flaps, Sakai saw the sleek, beautiful Zeros. These planes had given Japan air control for 2 long years. They were nimble, elegant, and effective. They were like the samurai spirit in steel. This new American plane, this Hellcat, would be just another easy target. But Sakai and his friends could not possibly know one thing. The laughter in that tent was a sign of big changes. It would reshape the Pacific Air War. They laughed at the Hellcat because they did not understand its goal. They believed air combat was a duel. They saw it as an art form. Americans were about to show them it was an industry. The Hellcat was not a duelist. It was a systematic warplane. This story shows how that laughter turned to worry. It shows how a plane, mocked for its weight, won many battles. It tells how it slowly overwhelmed an empire's air force, one fight at a time. To understand why they laughed, you must understand the Zero's impact. In the first year of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi Zero was a huge problem. It arrived in the skies as a strong opponent. This fighter was so much better than what the Allies had. It seemed almost like a myth. It was an agile plane among less easy-to-turn rivals. Its low weight allowed it to outturn anything Americans or British could use. The P-40 Warhawk, the F-4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo. One by one, they faced the Zero's amazing quickness. They also faced the superb skill of its pilots. These were not just any pilots. They trained in the world's toughest naval aviation program. An average Japanese naval pilot in 1941 had over 700 hours of flight time. Much of this was learned flying over China. They were a warrior elite. They lived by the Bushido spirit. They saw air combat as more than just a battle. It was a personal test of will. Saburo Sakai was the perfect example of this way of thinking. He always wanted to be the best. He had become an unbeatable ace. He and his friends were sure of their technical edge. The numbers proved they were right. The shock of the Zero was real. Over the Philippines, they destroyed many American planes. They suffered very few losses themselves. The Zero seemed incredibly effective. It had the range of a bomber. It had the quickness of a biplane. This was a combination that defied common ideas. Allied pilots tried to fight the Zero on its own terms. They tried to get into a turning dogfight. This put them at a big disadvantage. The Zero would quickly get into a good position. A burst from its cannons would often disable their plane. The American F-4F Wildcat was the Navy's main fighter. It was a tough airplane. Its pilots called it a product of the Grumman Iron Works for a reason. It could take a lot of damage that would make a Zero fall apart. But it was slower. It was less nimble. It could not climb as well as its Japanese rival. Wildcat pilots learned to survive. They created defensive moves. One was the famous thatch weave. In this, 2 friendly fighters would cross paths. They would lure a pursuer into the wingman's guns, but these were ways to survive. They were not for taking control of the air. They reduced losses. They did not win the sky completely. The uncertainty among Allied pilots was real. They felt like their plane was just not good enough, so the confidence of the Japanese pilots was not simple foolishness. Their laughter at reports of a new, heavier American fighter was earned. It came from a year of clear air control. They had every reason to believe the current trend would continue. But they were wrong. The time of the Zero's dominance was about to end. For the United States Navy, a quick answer was needed. The lesson was clear. It had been learned through the experience of their pilots. They needed a new fighter. It needed to be more than just better. It had to be designed for a different battle purpose, a plane built not to copy the Zero, but to fight against it. The search for a solution did not start in a lab. It started with experienced F6F Wildcat pilots coming back from the front lines. Grumman engineers talked to these pilots often. They listened to stories of not being able to catch a Zero. They heard about watching it turn quickly. They learned its strengths. More importantly, they began to list its weaknesses. The pilots who survived encounters with the Zero did so by using its few flaws. The Zero could not keep up in a high-speed dive. Its controls got stiff at high speeds. This made it less easy to turn. It was also built lighter. It did not have pilot armor. It lacked fuel tanks that could seal themselves after a hit. A few good hits from the Wildcat's 50 caliber machine guns could badly damage a Zero. While this important information was being collected, Americans had some good luck. In June of 1942, a Zero plane had engine trouble. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was flying it. This happened during a raid on Dutch Harbor. It was in the Aleutian Islands. He tried to make an emergency landing on Akatan Island. His landing gear dug into the soft ground. The plane flipped over. Sadly, he died. There in the remote wilderness lay an almost perfect Zero. The Akatan Zero, as it became known, was a treasure for intelligence. It was carefully taken apart. It was shipped to the United States. It went through many flight tests. For the first time, American engineers could fully study their opponent. They confirmed what their pilots had thought. The Zero was amazing lightweight engineering. But it was full of trade-offs. Armor, pilot protection, strong build, even good radios, all had been given up. This was to make it quick and give it a long range. What the Japanese saw as perfect design, American engineers at Grumman saw as a big weakness. The plan for the Zero's counterplane was now clear. Leroy Grumman and his team at the Iron Works did not try to build a better dogfighter. They decided to build a heavyweight fighter. The new plane would not try to outdance the Zero in a turning fight. That was a losing idea. Instead, it would use pure power. It would have overwhelming firepower. It would be extremely tough. This would let it control the fight. The design already being worked on was supercharged with this new knowledge. Grumman made a key decision. They put in the massive Pratt & Whitney R280 double wasp engine. It had 2,000 horsepower. This engine was the heart of the new way of thinking. It would give the fighter the power to climb above its enemies. It would have the speed to dive on them. It could fight when it wanted and leave when it wanted. This new plane would be heavy, but it was weight for a reason. It carried hundreds of pounds of armor plating. This protected the cockpit and engine. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. These could take hits without exploding, and it would carry 650 caliber machine guns. This much gunfire could severely damage a Zero's lighter frame in seconds. The whole idea was a direct answer to the Zero. Where the Zero was light, the Hellcat would be strong. Where the Zero was nimble, the Hellcat would be powerful. Where the Zero risked its pilot for performance, the Hellcat would protect its pilot no matter what. So, you can understand why the Japanese pilots laughed. They were looking at a machine that broke all their rules for a great fighter. What they did not know was that Americans were not just building a new plane. They were creating a whole new set of rules for air battles. When the Grumman F6F Hellcat began appearing in mid-1943, it was a complete opposite to the Zero. Lined up on a carrier deck, it lacked the Zero's delicate grace. It was wide, broad-chested, and brutally useful. It looked exactly like the heavyweight the Japanese pilots had made fun of. But this machine came from a different and much more effective way of thinking. At its core was that powerful engine. The Pratt & Whitney R280 double wasp churned out over 2,000 horsepower. This power plant was the heart of a new battle plan. It gave the Hellcat an amazing climb rate and impressive speed, especially at high altitudes where the Zero struggled. This power gave a Hellcat pilot the biggest advantage, the ability to choose when and where to fight. If things looked bad, he could simply use his speed to escape. Wrapped around this engine was a frame built with classic Grumman toughness. The company's idea was simple: build planes that bring their pilots home. The Hellcat had over 200 pounds of armor plating. This shielded the pilot and important systems. The fuel tanks sealed themselves. This helped stop fires. The windshield was bullet-resistant glass. Pilots would come back in Hellcats that looked badly damaged. Wings shredded and full of holes. And they would live to tell their story. This ability to survive was not just good for morale. It meant they kept their most valuable asset, experienced pilots. And those pilots had a strong weapon. The Hellcat carried 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns. This was a devastating spray of heavy bullets. It could tear a fragile Zero apart in seconds. American pilots were trained to aim for the Zero's wings. This is where the unprotected fuel tanks were. It quickly disabled the quick fighter. When the first reports on the Hellcat reached Japan, they met with disbelief and jokes. The Japanese analysis saw the Hellcat's weight. It was over 12,000 pounds loaded. The Zero was 6,000 pounds. They decided it would be a clumsy plane. Their whole battle plan was based on the turning dogfight. By their calculations, the Hellcat could not possibly compete, and they were absolutely right. The Hellcat had no chance in a turning fight with a Zero. The deadly flaw in their thinking was assuming the Hellcat would ever be foolish enough to try. This was made worse by a huge gap in pilot training. Japan's group of experienced veteran pilots was shrinking. The strict training program that had created men like Saburo Sakai could not keep up with the losses. By 1944, new Japanese pilots went to the front. They had a tiny fraction of the flight hours their older pilots had. In contrast, the United States was turning pilot training into a factory process. New American naval aviators arrived in the Pacific. They had 500 to 600 flight hours. Many had 200 hours in the Hellcat itself. America was not just building a better plane. It was mass-producing better-prepared pilots. The stage was set. The laughter was about to stop. The first big battles confused the Japanese pilot. When Hellcats saw their first major action in September of 1943, the results were a big shock. The Japanese expected a slow beast. They met an unexpected opponent. The Hellcats refused to play their game. Instead, they used a cold, careful way to fight, boom and zoom. A Hellcat pilot used his powerful engine. He would climb high above the fight. From there, he would pick a target. He would roll over and dive downwards. He turned altitude into amazing speed. The Zero below often would not see it coming. The Hellcat would scream through the formation. It would make a single devastating pass. Its 650 calibers fired for just a split second. Then, using that energy, it would shoot back up to safety. It would set up another attack. For all its quickness, the Zero was at a disadvantage. If it tried to follow the Hellcat in a dive, its controls would stiffen. If it tried to follow in the climb, its weaker engine would leave it a vulnerable target. On top of that, there was the thatch weave. Wildcat pilots perfected this team tactic. It turned the Zero's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. When a Zero got on a Hellcat's tail, its wingman would turn towards it. The targeted pilot would then turn to face his wingman. This forced the Zero to either give up or fly right into the second Hellcat's guns. It was simple, it was effective, and it was often overwhelming. The impact hit the Japanese naval air forces hard. Pilots who had been masters of the sky now faced constant pressure. Their reports were full of disbelief. The new American fighter was not clumsy, it was brutally fast. It would not turn and fight in a long battle. It just appeared from above. It killed with terrifying speed, and it vanished. Against the Zero, the Hellcat quickly achieved a remarkable victory rate. The mental impact was huge. This growing fear finally reached its peak on June 19, 1944. It was a single terrible day in the history of Japanese naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan launched Operation A-Go. It sent nearly 450 aircraft at the American fleet. It was supposed to be the final blow. Instead, it became a heavy defeat. American radar saw them coming from over 100 miles away. Task Force 58 scrambled hundreds of F6F Hellcats. What happened next was a large-scale battle. The American pilots were expertly guided by their ship's fighter directors. They met the Japanese formations in a perfectly planned defense. The Japanese pilots, many of them new, flew into a wall of bullets. The Hellcats, with their advantages in speed, armor, and firepower, won. One American pilot famously said, "Why hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot saw over 300 Japanese planes destroyed on the first day. This was for the loss of only about 30 American planes. And what of the one-eyed ace who had laughed? Saburo Sakai was no longer a frontline combat pilot. His injuries had made him an instructor. He was stationed on Iwo Jima in June 1944. He watched as the young men he trained were sent into the intense fighting. He had taught them the art of the dogfight. These were the skills that made him a legend. Now he heard the returning pilots' troubled accounts. They spoke of a blue machine that could not be turned. It could not be caught. And it was incredibly tough. The laughter in the operations tent a year earlier had turned into a bitter realization. A master watched his art become old-fashioned. His students were sent into impossible battles. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot might have been the Hellcat's biggest achievement, but its job was not done. For the rest of the war, it was the main American fighter in the Pacific sky. The final numbers are amazing. Over its 2 years of main combat service, the F6F Hellcat was credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft. This was in United States and British service. This accounted for 56% of all United States Navy and Marine air-to-air victories in the entire war. Against those thousands of victories, only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat. This led to an incredible overall victory-to-loss rate. It is often said to be 19-1. The plane earned a new nickname, the Ace Maker. An astounding 305 United States Navy pilots became aces flying the Hellcat. That is more than in any other American fighter. Men like Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, became legends at its controls. The Hellcat was not just a powerful machine. It was forgiving. It was a stable platform for shooting. And most important of all, it brought its pilots home. This allowed them to gain experience. They became even more formidable. For Japan, the results were huge. The loss of experienced pilots became a drain that could not be fixed. By the end of the war, the pre-war group of elite combat pilots was practically wiped out. This eventually led to Japan's most desperate tactic, the kamikaze attacks. The rise of organized suicide attacks was the final admission of conventional defeat in the air. When your pilots can no longer survive an encounter with the enemy, the final strategy becomes using the pilot himself as the weapon. The kamikaze was a tragic final act. It was for an air force that had been torn apart by the Hellcat, and by the industrial system it represented. Years after the war, Saburo Sakai, the ace who survived, thought about the conflict. He never lost respect for his beloved Zero. He saw it as a pure way of air combat, but he had come to understand a harsh truth. The Zero was the better fighter, he reportedly said, but the Hellcat was the better weapon system. There is another moving quote often said by Sakai that sums it all up. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war did so because a Hellcat pilot chose to spare them. That is the ultimate defeat. To exist at the mercy of your enemy. Whether he said those exact words or not, the feeling captures the harsh reality. Japan had brought a beautifully made weapon to a technologically advanced conflict. They believed they were samurai. The Hellcat proved they were simply men with old weapons facing the future. So the story of the Hellcat versus the Zero is more than just a tale of two planes. It is the story of two ways of thinking about war colliding in mid-air. One, the Japanese way, was based on individual skill. It prized quickness and a warrior spirit, a belief that the man could overcome any material weakness. The other, the American way, was one of systems. It focused on overwhelming force. It valued industrial-scale production. And above all, it prioritized the survival of the person operating the machine. The F6F Hellcat was the perfect symbol of that American philosophy. It was not designed to win duels. It was designed to win a war. It was heavy because it carried the weight of armor. It had a powerful engine and a belief that valued a pilot's life. The Japanese pilots laughed because they could not see past the weight. They could not understand that every extra pound on the Hellcat was not a weakness. It was a piece of a full weapon system. A system of radar direction, coordinated tactics, superior training, and industrial might. These were things they just could not match. By the time the laughter stopped, Japan's air forces had been effectively pushed aside. The plane they mocked had not just defeated their legendary Zero, it had made its entire reason for being obsolete. The one-eyed ace, Saburo Sakai, lived to see the peace. He was a living reminder of an era of air combat that had vanished. It disappeared in the face of industrial exactness. The Hellcat had proven that, in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is not always the sharpest sword. It is the most robust and never-stopping tool.